Okay. Excellent. All right. Hopefully we've got a few people online at the moment. There's a little bit of a delay our end, so we will kick off and let me just fiddle around with these buttons here. I want to welcome everyone to the AWI Feed Nutrition Project live stream. I'm Tanya Morgan from MSF. And I'm joined by Dr. Nick Poltridge, who is our new project manager with a focus on livestock projects and carbon. Welcome, Nick. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Tanya.
Excellent. And we've also got Hamish Dickson on the line from AgriPartner Consulting, and he has been working on the AWI Feed Nutrition Project. Welcome, Hamish. Great to see you.
Hi, thank you.
Excellent. All right, so today our focus is on feed nutrition and livestock considerations following a very wet spring and going into what looks like a very wet summer. So these are not normal conditions for us in the Mallee. It's definitely something that probably you're more familiar with, Nick, being a livestock producer from Narracourt. And Hamish, you started off working with MSF when you were at Clare, but now you're based just out of Orange in New South Wales. Pretty wet over your way at the moment.
Yeah, yep. It's the wet season has certainly continued for us, and quite a lot more rain even over the last sort of 48 hours. And yeah, we've certainly had a very wet season compared to most. And yeah, like a lot of areas of Eastern Australia, I suppose there's certainly some country that's flooded out at the moment as well. So bit of a challenge, but battling through.
Yeah, definitely challenging times. We're going to focus a bit on feed nutrition, but we're also going to cover animal health issues during a wet season. So what are you currently seeing in livestock as wet season issues at the moment?
Look, I think certainly there's all the really common stuff. Certainly worms have been a big challenge this season, and I think they're starting to probably take off even more than ever now that we're gradually getting a little bit more warmer conditions. But yeah, worms have been challenging for the last little while. There just hasn't been much of a break for many pastures in terms of a typical sort of hot summer to knock some numbers down. Flies are really starting to kick in it now in many regions. We've certainly been seeing more fly activity over the last couple of weeks, and I think in many other areas, especially where it's a bit warmer, that's been starting up for a bit longer again. So that's going to be, I think, a challenge. The other big ones I think that have been around a lot is obviously feed health, keeping an eye on how that's tracking. Certainly feed have been a challenge in many areas with such a wet season, and especially over successive wet seasons in many areas. That's been a challenge. So all the usual things from scald to abscess to foot rot to everything. So that's been a big challenge, I think, for many places. And I think the other ones that tend to creep in these seasons can be just watching animal condition. I think sometimes we get caught looking out at a paddock of green and the bulk is there. But one of the things that tends to happen is the quality is usually down in these sorts of seasons too, because we produce so much bulk. So it's not unusual for lamb growth rates to be lower than we would typically experience. Sometimes we get caught with ewes coming in prejoining and it's not quite at the condition we thought they would have been, and it's because typically the feed quality is just down a bit on normal. So those sorts of impacts can come into play. The challenge with some of those is they have knock-on effects to either the successive joining of those ewes if they're back in condition, or potentially the lambs aren't finished at the time that we expect them to be as well. And there's a few of the odd things that might come up around listeria and abortion diseases and things like that, and we can touch on that a little bit today potentially.
Beautiful. All right. At this point, I think I just want to just quickly go through a quick disclaimer that the information we're covering today is general in nature and may omit details that are important to you and your circumstances. So we just encourage everyone to check with your own advisor or your farm consultant that you work with before you implement any of the advice you hear today. But with that, thanks, Hamish. We will hand over to you, and I would just encourage people to send through questions. We are monitoring the chat at the moment, so if you have anything you want to ask Hamish or Nick, send them through, and I'll moderate that. And over to you, Nick.
Yeah, well, thanks for that sort of intro to some of the animal health issues we could expect in a wet spring. Just homing a bit more on the nutritional aspects. What sort of feed options are you seeing your clients look to now, given that stubbles aren't ready yet? What sort of comments can you give us on nutrition in this wet spring?
I think, look, in many areas, obviously the stubbles may only be just arriving, or we've got a little while to go before they become available. I suppose that the positives are that some species, like if we've got lucerne in some of those pastures, or even some of the grasses, are hanging on further than they typically would. Clovers are certainly further behind. Same with medics. They're all extending potentially a little bit further into the season than we would normally see. So whilst in many areas we may not have the stubbles ready to roll, we do have some alternatives that are on the cards potentially. The juggle is always just, have we got enough area and enough feed on offer to sort of juggle the demand and the supply side of things. But those sorts of feed options, potentially have still got reasonable quality. One of the things we've always got to look at is what class of animals are we actually talking about now. If we've talked about ewes that have weaned lambs already, they're dry at this point, maybe we're coming up to or just starting joining, well, their demand is fairly low, and the quality may be sufficient to actually meet their nutritional requirements. The challenge is more so when we're looking at, say, weaner lambs, high energy requirements, high protein requirements, really trying to drive high intake levels. That's where feed quality, even though we might still have some green in the system, if it is at the stage where the plants are still continuing to flowering, setting seed, then the quality is still coming down despite some green still present. And depending on how hard you're trying to push growth rates with those lambs, that's when we're in the boat of looking at, okay, well, potentially we try and supplement with a little bit of grain on top just to help balance out that feed and push the growth rates along, if that's the end game.
Yeah, and I guess it's an unusual situation for people to be looking at joining on green feed this year, but I guess some of your clients are experiencing that now.
Yeah, they are, and I think that's that's been a good thing. I think we've seen potentially rams coming through pre-joining in quite good condition. They've come through, they've been on green feed, they've in some way, I guess, had the typical effect of what we normally do with giving some lupins pre-lambing. They've got a higher protein intake, they've got a higher energy intake coming through with a slightly more favourable spring and up to now. And often their condition is quite good. And then the same thing with the ewes, as long as they've been looked after and monitored and their condition is good, then they in some ways have had a bit more of a natural flush this season too. So so I think, on the whole, that there is some opportunity there, and I think we may well see hopefully some better than normal conception rates coming through. That's not uncommon in these sorts of seasons. The challenge then comes later in the season when we've got hopefully a higher conception rate, that we've got to support potentially a high number of multiples and get those lambs on the ground out the other side.
Yeah, so there could be some nutritional aspects to focus on in summer. Are you expecting the stubble quality might not be there later on, so you might have to supplement a bit more in the summer?
Yeah, that's right. It does, it's a bit of a changing scenario in these sorts of seasons, isn't it? Where potentially you have to watch really closely in that, on one hand, come harvest time, it may well be that there's a lot more grain left behind. If we've got down crop, even in some heavy crops, we may well just have a lot more grain out in the stubble. So on one hand, that might well be a really positive thing for the stubble quality. The actual straw material and the residue that's left there would probably be lower quality than normal. But in saying that, it's typically a fairly low proportion of the intake, or of the nutritional intake anyway, of those animals. So that kind of doesn't make as big a difference as the fact that we potentially can have a lot more grain, spilt grain left behind. and especially if we have, you know, some areas of paddocks or larger areas of paddocks that are actually down and can't be harvested properly, then they will provide quite good quality in the paddock for stock to graze on. There may well be areas in some patches of Australia where you know, we can't actually harvest areas because it's just too wet to get on that part of the paddock, and depending on what plays out, that may get grazed later, or if it does dry out, then we can come back and harvest it afterwards. But that may well be another part of the equation of looking at, well, what quality is actually available in the paddock this season compared to normal. The other thing that potentially comes into play is if we do have more spilt grain and we continue to get this wet weather, well, does it then shoot? And have we lost that as a grain resource on the ground? That's the other thing that happens, you know, in these seasons where all of a sudden we've converted the grain into effectively a seedling. And they're eating green pick rather than necessarily grain off the dry ground. So that can change, obviously, that equation there too, you know, in that scenario where we've got, you know, lots of that green pick coming through from sprouted grain. Well, we've turned what was, you know, potentially a high energy dry feed resource into a high energy, high protein, very wet feed resource in the form of shoots. So that's got quality aspects to it, but it may well change how we approach feeding in that sort of scenario too.
Yeah. Now, you might have covered some of the animal health aspects earlier, but yeah, what are people having to get their sheep in and jet them, or how much fly trouble are we seeing this season? I think you mentioned worms.
Yeah, it's starting. Yeah, absolutely. So it's certainly starting. So I think, you know, for most places, it's looking at, well, what's the program for shearing and crutching, you know, as a start, and what's just the base risk factor from that perspective. But yeah, certainly, you know, I think in general you can see, you know, even across things like Facebook and Twitter, you see everyone's, you know, jetting machines are out, clicking, whatever chemical control programs are certainly starting to fire off. Even locally here, I know, like we've started jetting all our sheep, and speaking with the rural retailers around here, you know, demand for all those sorts of products has obviously started to kick right off. So that will be in play, and I think the other part to it is often at this time of year, you know, we're trying to create a little bit of buffer to what's currently or going to be a busy period with harvest and everything else as well. So, you know, trying to make sure that we've got protection programs in place now to get us through this sort of window of time where inevitably there's a little less focus on sheep when harvest is in full swing.
Moving on to the AWI project that we've been working on for the past couple of years. So you've now got 2 years worth of data on common feeds in the Mallee. Mm-hmm. What are some of the key learnings that farmers might apply over the next couple of months?
I think certainly we've seen some standout results, and we've seen some expected results. It's been an interesting comparison between the two. So we've seen feed quality extend on in these sorts of seasons already, and I think the driving force is always look at really what the stage of growth of the plant is to get a gauge on what the quality is like. You know, I think sometimes we get a little bit stuck when we're looking at feed testing in season or month and how that compares. But I think, you know, over the last couple of years when this project's been running, we've had quite variable seasons with late breaks and two very different weather seasons. And it's been particularly interesting to compare tests at the same month of time, which has actually resulted in completely different stage of growth of these plants. And that's the important thing to be thinking about. And I think we all know that deep down, of course, it's more relevant to be thinking about, well, is it in early growth phase? Are we going reproductive? Is it senescent, obviously? And that's a big part of what's happening in these sorts of seasons is we're getting further into or later into the year, and potentially the stage of growth is at a slightly earlier phase. And that's the big quality aspect. So I think, you know, we certainly saw that the broad trend where that early growth phase is highest quality for energy and protein, which is expected. Probably some of the standouts were certainly the legumes did very well in terms of holding quality for longer. So lucerne is one that we would normally expect to see that quality extend on for, and it did, but it did very much more in an extended growing season as well for us, which is good. So that will be one that I think now we will probably see quite good quality of anything with that sort of legume content in there. Equally, you go back to something like more of a veld grass, and despite probably having some green in the sample, it got to the stage where effectively as soon as it was starting to run up and put a head out, then the quality was coming right down. So, again, we can say, well, stage of growth is important, and if it's, in that growth phase, then the quality is there. But equally, don't let a little bit of green deceive you. If it's getting to that reproductive and almost pushing on to senescent stage, even though there's a little bit of green in the base of it, the quality has actually fallen well away. And that was one of our probably sharpest movers in terms of the quality being, really low through that sort of dry senescent stage, fast peak in that growth stage. But as soon as it started going reproductive, the quality plummeted. Whereas, even with something like a lucerne, it can start going reproductive, but it will hold that quality for quite a long period as well. So I think in these sorts of seasons, there's going to be a lot of variation between the type of species that we're working with. And that's been one of the valuable parts of testing feed as well. And I think in these years, we're going to have a huge level of variation to what we normally expect. And doing a feed test is not a difficult thing, and could well be worthwhile, especially for stock that we're trying to really target the nutrition towards. So whether that's, ewes that we're trying to get joining nutrition spot on for, or young growing stock that we potentially are supplementing, then, feed testing in these sorts of seasons is more important than ever, because we can get that nutrition just right. And especially
you could probably expect lower quality hay and lower protein grain.
Yep. That's right. And that's the other part to it is understanding the feed base that you're working with in the paddock, and testing that. And it may well, it's just as important to potentially be testing the supplementary feed that you're using as well. So the hay that you're using, the grain that you're using, because we will see the effects come through in that as well.
So what are some of the issues you anticipate with those lower quality feeds becoming part of the main staple diet going forward? Like, not everyone's going to go out and test. They're just going to have more feed on hand. There's going to be more spoiled stuff around. They'll probably just throw more feed out there. What are some of the issues that come with that?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's very much just becomes more of a costly game in that scenario. So if we're buying feed based on average values, or even just backing it off a bit to try and account for them to some degree, the reality is that, let's say we go out and we need, we need some cereal hay later in the season, and we're working on an average of 8.5 ME. The reality is there's plenty of cereal hay that's going to be coming out at 6.5, 7 ME. And even if it's 7.5 to 8, it doesn't sound like an awful lot just on a half mega or a megajoule of energy basis. But the reality is, over a period of time, that may account for $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 worth of different feeding bills. Those sorts of scenarios, it can be quite important to sort of work through and understand, well, what is the difference in quality, and what does that mean for the feeding that we're doing. If you don't know the quality of that hay or that grain that you're buying, then inevitably what either ends up happening is you feed your normal amount and the animal performance may be different to what you expect, or equally you end up feeding just more to account to the fact that you're trying to push them harder, so your feed cost is slightly higher. Either way, you wear an impact one way or the other that you may not be necessarily expecting.
Yeah, and hay's not going to be cheap this year, even if it is of a poorer quality.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think the outlook has changed quite quickly from what we were at, several months ago, with bumper harvest, bumper grain availability was on the horizon, and same with hay was looking good. But yeah, that's had a fairly sharp turn.
Yeah.
And with fungal issues in our stubbles, what do we need to look out for there, Hamish?
Yeah, look, it's another one that will be on the cards. I think certainly, any sort of molds and toxins in those sorts of feed are worth considering. So if we're finding lots of mold in feed, then we need to be careful about how we're using it. Ideally, we need to sort of have some sort of identification on what it is before we use it, and remembering that the animals that typically are at most at risk are pregnant animals. There's a lot of abortion risks with many of those moldy feeds. The other one that can come through is even with lambs that might be eating a lot of down crop or hay that's potentially been windrowed and left in the paddock is that they may not go for it, but it's still a palatability issue. So if they're not eating it and the consumption is not there, then we're still going to see a potential outcome that even if there's not a toxicity risk, then it's potentially a production risk because they're just getting into it. The other thing that we've seen a little bit of probably around the place over the last 6 to 9 months has been things like listeria as an abortion disease in sheep. And that's largely a result of contamination in feed. So lots of feed buildup. We see grazing crops where we've got lots of residue and wet mouldy residue at the bottom of the paddock, and then having effectively coming through the other side and going, lambing percentages weren't what we thought they should have been. And in many of those situations, people just don't find the dead lambs, and that's kind of their clue because they've been aborted earlier. And they might be down 10-15% in that sort of scenario on what they would normally expect. So I guess that's one thing to be thinking about is in these sorts of seasons, especially one that we've come through now, if there was something like that going on, then that might be just a bit of a process about, was that impacting our last lambing? And equally, moving forward, if we have another season the way it goes, then that should be on the radar again.
So what sort of mitigation strategies can we put in place for something like that? Don't put it in the paddock.
Yeah, it's tough. Effectively, it's removing the feed, which is difficult. So one thing is identifying it at the time. So if you do have any aborted lambs in that scenario, you can get them tested and find out if that is the cause, because don't forget that there are other reasons or other abortive diseases that can be in play. But one is just identifying that, and the other part is really just watching the feed, throughout pregnancy there, if they are really on, thick, and in many of the situations we're grazing crops that were effectively just being grown as a feeding resource, and they weren't intended for harvest. So there was just a huge amount of biomass, and at the bottom of those paddocks was just spoiled with feed. So looking at those sorts of risk factors and trying to probably move them away from pregnant ewes is the ideal, but it can be challenging to juggle that amongst everything else on farm.
So normally we put sheep in containment lots when it's dry and droughty. Is that something to consider when it's really wet and you not sure of the quality of or the toxicity issues out in the paddock?
It can, I suppose it could be. I think the challenge is those sorts of conditions aren't ideal for containment either. If we're getting a lot of extended wet weather, then we end up in a scenario where it's difficult to feed. The pen's getting muddy. It certainly is done at times. We've done it in the past, and not the ideal scenario. But I think hopefully you sort of try and find an alternative place on farm rather than necessarily going into containment in that sort of a season. If it's that wet, then it's your plan B or C, not plan A.
And at this point, I'd just like to remind people that we still have got time for you to send your questions through. If anything's come up that has triggered a question, just please send it through in the comments and we'll get Hamish to address that. I have got a question here from the audience. So this is not so much about feed. This is going back to mosquitoes being a problem and can kill sheep given the right conditions. Dorpers, horses and probably cattle are the ones that this person's heard of. Have you heard of anything like that with sheep?
No, I haven't. It's not to say it doesn't happen, but I'm not aware of anything along that line. So we might take that question on notice if you like. I can have a bit of a dig to see if we can find any resources around that area and potentially, send it through afterwards. But apologies, can't be of much help on that front.
Yeah. Okay. No other questions yet from my end. So, Nick, what else have you got
I was just going to ask, I don't know, just prompt Hamish to comment on the upcoming workshops that we've got planned for next year. We're going to tease out a lot of this. We're going to give a lot more detail on the way the feed tested out for the Mallee. Any other thoughts on the content for the workshops next year, Hamish?
Yeah, so I think, if we take a step back in terms of the project, look, we've got a couple of years of feed testing information on a whole range of different species, some, typical pastures, some crops, some novel species that are in there. And we've tested those not only for nutrient value, like our typical energy, protein, fibre, dry matter content, but also minerals. So it's an interesting additional piece that you don't always get when you're doing feed testing. So obviously a big part of the workshops that we're looking to put in for early next year will be going through all of those results and looking at the comparisons between species and between seasons and how that's all played out. But I guess the important part of any of that information is how you utilise it on farm. So I think in the workshops that follow on will be, okay, well, look, this is the feed quality that we found across these different species typical to the Mallee environment. And then we'll go into a little bit of nutrition. I think some nutrition around how that impacts on the animal is really important. We'll go through comparing animal requirements to feed on offer, how we actually formulate diets to supplement sheep in different scenarios, and really just try and link that together, I think, more than anything else. Probably the other important aspect which is useful to look at in relation to feed quality is how the different species that have been tested play out from a quantity perspective, from a feed on offer throughout the season perspective. Because it's one thing to understand, right, well, these particular species provide the highest quality of feed and at what time, but are they actually producing the biomass when we want it or when we need it? And that's a big linkage, I think, with any livestock farming enterprise is we start to provide the total feed on offer when we need it, and that's to suit demand of our flock, depending on your lambing time. So how that plays out is an important consideration, I think. And then probably the final piece we'll be looking at, well, a number of publications that will come out of this project, and how we utilise some of those publications and published feed test results, and how you can use those to, I guess, in further training and things like using the feed quality data to feed into lifetime management courses and further activities that people can.
Yeah, that's really good. So we'll look at running those workshops in Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia. There's one scheduled for each state, and that will take place sort of February, March next year. So we'll keep people posted to those dates as soon as possible. And we'll also be able to discuss other supplementary feeding issues, because we'll have a better idea of what sort of grain and hay quality we're looking at as a whole after harvest. Hopefully harvest is finished by then. We'll see how we go. You had a question, Nick, about supplements.
It was a question without notice. It was just an idea. I just wonder, that there's a lot of different products that people are being talked about for greenhouse mitigation and also the improvement of growth rates. It would be interesting to have a little section on that in our workshops too, provided we can find some content for it, I guess, Hamish.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Look, I'm always open to chucking a few things like that in there, and look, we can bring a bit of that information in. That there's lots of interesting pieces that come into that. From obviously, there's been a huge amount of publicity around things like seaweed. So there's those. I mean, biochar been another one that's in that.
Yes.
Space. And I mean, even some of the things like urea supplementation have had effects over time as well. So
yes,
there's probably a little bit of discussion around that we can potentially bring up.
We can help bring some clarity to that complex topic at those workshops too.
long as we don't get into the carbon trading space, that's fine.
Yes.
What about supplements over a wet summer? What do we need to consider there?
So there's probably two parts. One is the supplementation from a nutritional aspect around just energy and protein. So some of that goes back to probably just looking at, well, supplements at a core level for things like grain and hay are important to understand. Urea may be one of those ones that kicks in a little bit more in this sort of season. Typically a urea block or a liquid with urea in it, isn't on everyone's radar, and in some seasons, is a little bit more difficult. But in a season like this, where we're going to expect that protein later into summer is probably going to be a limiting factor, it might be something to think about when you're putting any sort of supplementation program together. It can just give that little bit of boost in protein that is sometimes needed. So sometimes urea plus a cereal grain might be a perfect scenario for topping up ewes that are running around on dry feed or something like that. So that's probably one little thing to look at. And then the other one is certainly just not forgetting things like your mineral supplementation. So there's still a base that we look at. So if we've got stock that are on, say, a cereal stubble, even a down cereal crop or a standing cereal crop, inevitably, whether we are testing cereal stubble, cereal hay, cereal grain, they're always low in calcium. So the standing rules around things like at the minimum, some lime and salt out in those sorts of situations is useful to be thinking about. And then some trace mineral stuff that we can potentially dig into in much more detail in these workshops next year. But we certainly found some tests where things like cobalt and selenium, which are probably two of the big ones that are in a lot of products for stock. So cobalt's synthesized into vitamin B12 in the rumen. So typically, if you've got enough cobalt in the system, you've got enough cobalt in feed, then you have enough vitamin B12. In a lot of the tests that we did, almost regardless of season, they were actually adequate for those. There was only an odd, I think we might have had 2 or 3 samples out of the ones that we did that were deficient in those. So that's an interesting one that, I think with a bit of that information and in some ways that's a test that many producers could look at doing on their own place. And that helps you decide whether you need selenium, whether you need B12 in vaccines and drenches and all those sorts of products. So those sorts of trace minerals are a little bit more dependent on the particular circumstances of the farm, and even in some degree less seasonally influenced on the minerals too. So seasonally dry, certainly even to a degree. They're a little bit stage of growth as well, more than anything. So I'd be more thoughtful of the core energy and protein content that we're dealing with and addressing those issues, I think.
So you're talking about sampling. Where is the best place to get the feed test done, and what sort of price are we looking at?
So there's a number of labs around. Most of the departments of ags have got some links to various labs in the state that you can utilise. For this particular project, a lot of the samples went through feed test in Victoria there. But like I say, New South Wales TPI, I've got them. South Australia have got a number of labs that they utilise. There's a number of private labs. Obviously, we just try to target ones that are accredited, so that we know that the tests are reliable. But typically, price-wise, $60, $70 for a test, around that sort of mark, will get you most of the nutritive value work back. So that'll give you the core of what you need. It'll give you energy, protein, fibre, dry matter content, all that sort of stuff.
Yep, great. We've had another question come in from some of our viewers online. Will dipping sheep interrupt joining?
Yeah, dipping as a whole can be a problem. In terms of really saying we're going to get a 5% drop or a 10% drop in conception rate, I've never seen anything that's actually really conclusively said that's the impact. The challenge can be, unfortunately, as carefully as you do it, it's a stressful event, and that's where a big part of the impact comes in. Is we're trying to minimise any sort of stressful event at the time of joining, and even for a week or two afterwards, from the ewe perspective, particularly. So, I think dipping is one part which is generally even more stressful than, say, a jetting, or even just down the race with some click or something like that, if you're trying to get something like some fly control. So it's ideally not done at joining time. The flip side is, if we're having huge issues with flies, then at the end of the day, in some way, shape or form, it's got to be dealt with. And if that's the only option, then probably stuck there in a position where it's probably going to have to happen. But yeah, I'd be concerned that there's some effect happening there.
Yeah. Okay.
And I've just had one last question come in, which is probably a little unfair. It's just to ask about patterns of lamb turn off this year. What are you seeing in your area? Are the lambs behind where they normally are? And I guess we're going to see a very gradual selling into the market over this spring compared to normal.
Yeah, I think so. I think we certainly haven't seen the big flushes that we normally would. So yeah, I think there's probably a couple of impacts. One is I think growth rates are probably back on normal to a degree. So we're seeing slightly less coming into the market from that perspective. And the other side is getting sheep to market is a challenge. And B, for many places, there's enough feed on hand to hold lambs back and finish to heavier weights. So that's probably part of it. And you combine that with, I guess, things like the prices over the last month or even 2 months, as many people probably haven't been as excited to sell sheep straight away. So I think it's probably been a little bit slower.
Provided their loosens hung on through the wet, then there should be plenty of lucerne around.
Yeah, that's it.
Have you had any more questions come in, Tanya?
No more questions through here, but I'm just wondering, have we covered the wet season issues enough? Are there any other health issues? I know you were talking about feet earlier. Anything else that people really need to be hot on in terms of monitoring sheep to make sure they get them through a wet summer?
Yeah. Look, I think they're the biggies. I think between flies, worms, feet, they're usually the big ones to address. And like I say, normally the other one that sort of sneaks in is usually just making sure we look after feed quality, and in those wet seasons, it can just be something that catches us off guard a little bit, especially say pre-joining, ewes come in, they're in good, they're just not quite at the level that we had hoped they were, which is more feed quality driven than anything else. But yeah, I think we touched on worms, we've touched on flies, feet for sure. It can be a challenge. So, there's plenty of places that are trimming feet because, we're just not getting the dry to really allow those feet to wear down, and the hoof growth is more than what we're seeing. So, feet getting trimmed, feet getting foot bathed, all that sort of stuff is radar in many places.
Yeah.
Do you reckon enough people are getting feed tests done? I'm sure there's an opportunity for more people to get feed tests done, but it's a job that you don't always get around to doing too.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's I think we're seeing a gradual increase in it. I think probably some of it's driven by the hay side of things. We're getting more hay that's just by default getting tested, whether it's hay that's been potentially marked for export and being tested and then come back into the domestic market more. We're seeing online marketplaces for feed requiring that obviously there's full feed tests and full descriptions there, so people are becoming more familiar with looking at those results and how to use them. So that's certainly helping, and I think gradually we're seeing, as people get used to seeing those figures and what they mean, then they start to see the value in getting a test done of paddock feed quality and linking the two. So we're gradually seeing, I think, the use of that tool pick up. There's always room for more of it to be done, and look, it's a cost. It's not a big cost, but there's time to go out and get a sample and all those sorts of things. So it's not about testing every paddock every month. It's about being a little bit strategic about when is it important to know that information, what types of animals do we really want to get targeted with, which potentially does it not matter, what classes is it less important for. Maybe we don't do a test for them, but we know that that some groups that we really want to fine tune. So I think just being strategic on that stuff can help too.
Yeah, and this AWI project, part of the value of it is it gets us all more familiar with the concept of feed testing, and it gets us more information about geographically relevant feed tests, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, I think we've worked through our list of questions for you, Hamish, and nothing more coming through from the audience online. But I guess if anybody does have a question that we haven't answered today, please still feel free to direct message us or send us an email, and we're happy to address that and share that on our social media platforms. So I just want to acknowledge the support of AWI today. The Feed Nutrition Project has supported this Facebook Live event, so we're really thankful for that, and looking forward to wrapping up the project next year with these final workshops that will sort of bring together all the results and bring Hamish to the regions. We'll get Hamish back out into the Mallee and pick your brain a bit more then. So thanks very much, Hamish. Thank you, Nick. Well done.
Thanks,
on your
Tanya.
first
Thanks,
Facebook
Hamish.
Live. So this recording will be available for people to watch afterwards.
And we'll look forward to seeing you next year, Hamish, out in the Mallee.
Try and stay dry. Thanks, everyone.